Hello, everyone. I'm Liane Jackson, Senior Law Editor at Forbes, and today I am joined by Jon Jorge Aras, founder of Aras Law Firm and our resident legal expert. And today he is here to help us analyze, of course, one of the most talked about cases of the last couple weeks, I think we can safely say, Sean Diddy Combs and the criminal indictment against him. Thank you so much for joining us, Jon Jorge.
Thank you for having me.
So there is a lot to unpack here. This has been filed in the Southern District of New York, which has become known as the go-to location for any type of racketeering charges. And that is at the crux of this case. And so maybe to start, we can talk about how, of course, there's a lot of counts to this, and there's a number of counts to this indictment that involve sex trafficking, arson, prostitution. There's all sorts of allegations, but there's only certain criminal counts, and they're all part of a conspiracy that the U.S. attorneys are going to be trying to prove. Can you talk a little bit about what we are looking at here from a legal perspective?
Absolutely. I think a good way of looking at this case is not so much based on the individual acts alone, some of which you mentioned, arson, prostitution, sex trafficking, but a way to really conceptualize everything here is that Mr. Combs is being charged as part of an enterprise that he ran through his business. So the racketeering charge emanates from his conduct individually and then other people that worked in his enterprise that helped him engage in this type of conduct, allegedly. For example, sex trafficking or bringing someone from one state to another for the purposes of prostitution. So it's a broad ranging RICO racketeering charge, which focuses on the enterprise itself, along with the conduct of the individuals. But that's why this case is so far and wide ranging. Typically, a RICO charge was brought previously against mafia conduct because what ended up having to happen before, or that only individuals could be charged for their individual conduct. RICO enables both criminal and civil litigants to look at an entire enterprise. So a way to think about this is that Mr. Combs is at the top of essentially a criminal enterprise that was allegedly being run by him with the help of other people that were employed within that enterprise.
And interestingly, they don't have to say who else is involved, who the co-conspirators are. You don't get a lot of information usually in the indictments. The prosecution keeps it close to the vest. So here we don't know. Nobody else has been charged yet except for Diddy. These co-conspirators may never be charged, in fact, and they could potentially be working with the government. Is that also something that we can expect here, or are more charges likely?
It's very typical that in a case like this, especially of how broad ranging it is, and the attorneys, the prosecution has come out and stated it themselves and said this investigation is ongoing. So they had enough substance to be able to get a grand jury to indict Mr. Combs, and now the investigation will continue. However, in this process of bringing these charges, they will now look to individuals. The prosecution will look to individuals that were potentially involved. And here's where they may get their key witnesses for the case. Someone that is allegedly involved may have criminal exposure. And what will happen is that they will be offered potentially a deal to testify in return for a lower sentence. That's typically a way this case is attacked by the prosecution because they need evidence. So on the one hand, they're going to need victims to come forward and testify about their experience. We know that they have videotape and documentary evidence from the raid on Mr. Combs's home. And then the third component of that will be, are there people within this enterprise that are going to be willing to, for lack of a better term, flip on Mr. Combs and testify against him in trial in return for a better deal? The federal sentencing guidelines are very harsh for these types of alleged crimes. They could end up spending a lot of time in jail or come to an agreement, get some limited prosecution, maybe even potentially immunity in some cases to come forward and testify. Because as the press release made clear, and as all the press around this case is made clear, the target of this case is Mr. Combs.
Yeah, and we're talking about this today because yet another civil case has been filed against Mr. Combs by a woman, Talia Graves, with her attorney, well-known attorney Gloria Allred. It's just another civil complaint against Mr. Combs alleging assault and I believe rape in that case as well. You can talk a little bit more about that. But I'm curious about how the prosecution has used these allegations, whether it was from the original bombshell civil complaint by his ex-girlfriend, Cassie Ventura, that he settled civilly with her, and which you alluded to the videotape of her being assaulted in a hotel by Mr. Combs. But this newest complaint is just one of many that are since Ms. Ventura's complaint that have come out. And the prosecution is using these to build the criminal case, it appears. And also, we don't know exactly how many or which will be the victims that they would use to try to get in further charge Mr. Combs if needed, additional charges.
This is interesting from many different perspectives. First, the Department of Justice will use civil lawsuits as potentially a basis to start an investigation. Maybe there's a civil complaint that's filed in New York or in Los Angeles or wherever it may be involving a big profile person like Mr. Combs that alleges salacious allegations against him, and maybe that can start or spark an investigation. And I do believe to some extent that's likely what occurred here. The second component of it is that as these civil suits continue to roll out, these are individuals that may be potential victims for the Department of Justice to use as witnesses in their case against Mr. Combs. So they're able to mine this information. They're able to look at the court pleadings. They're able to look at the position that Mr. Combs will take in these litigations because he's going to have to continue to respond to them as they come out. And as we all know, an individual that's under the threat of criminal prosecution has an absolute Fifth Amendment right to not testify against themselves. You do not have to incriminate yourself by volunteering information. Mr. Combs is in a very difficult position to defend civil lawsuits while there is an ongoing criminal case on top of that, because any statement he were to make in those civil cases could be used as statements against him in the criminal case. So it's a very interesting confluence of the civil cases and the criminal case that are ongoing. And I expect it's likely that more individuals may come forward. The Department of Justice has urged more individuals to come forward and to tell their side of the story. Something about sexual assault cases is that it can be very difficult for victims to come to terms with what occurred to them in the first place, let alone to come out publicly and face the person who has allegedly done things to them that victimize them. So it's a very difficult area for prosecutors to go through and get victims to willingly come forward. But the way these civil lawsuits are playing out, it appears that may be a strategy that they employ. Reach out to the attorney that's representing an individual victim and see if they'd be willing to come in and sit down and talk to them about the case.
Yeah, and as you said, defending both civil lawsuits and a criminal case is quite a challenge. In fact, as we know, Diddy settled the case with Cassie Ventura within 24 hours of her filing that complaint. So that he tried to keep that under wraps, tried not to have to make statements regarding, except he did apologize for his behavior, and that was before then sort of a landslide of lawsuits, civil lawsuits against him then appeared. And to your point about getting women to come forward, getting witnesses to testify, getting people to maybe even turn state's evidence, so to speak, they have denied bail of any sort to Diddy. He offered to put up $50 million. He said that he would either sell or get rid of his jet. They would monitor him, drug tests, get rid of all electronics, all sorts of things to try to keep him out of the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn as sort of a notorious facility among others in New York. The judge said no, you are going to stay behind bars because of the potential for what they described as potential for witness tampering, obstruction of justice. What do you think about the judge's decision? How common is it for a potential, let's call him a non-violent offender, to be denied bail under these circumstances?
The Department of Justice, in filing their indictment, made an allegation that I think was very key to allowing the judge to come to this decision, which is that as part of running this alleged criminal enterprise, Mr. Combs was already involved in obstructing justice to not let this information get out ahead of time. So, based on that allegation, the idea behind denying him bail, obviously, number one, is a flight risk. He has tons of resources, and we know that when his house was initially raided, I believe that Mr. Combs fled the country or took a flight elsewhere. So he's shown maybe a pattern or a proclivity to be able to do something like that. So he has access to funds. On top of it, he's facing very, very serious charges that could see him spending the rest of his life in prison. So he'd be incentivized to do something where he would flee or run away from it. And I think that the judge was on firm ground in making a decision in this case. Someone of Mr. Combs's profile, especially with the type of conduct that's being alleged here, and really focusing on the fact that the Department of Justice alleged that he was already engaged in obstructing justice prior to the indictment being issued. I think that's a really, really key allegation that would allow them to make the arguments, which they did, and which the judge ultimately agreed with, is that Mr. Combs cannot be out of prison because he will have the chance to not only run away, but he will also have the chance to influence the outcome of this trial by pressuring individuals to not come forward. And this is a devastating blow for his defense team because it's so much more difficult as a defense attorney to work with your client and to build your case and to go over the information because you have limited access. You mentioned the detention center that he's in. It's not easy to go there on a daily basis and to do work and to build your case and to go through the details that you would need to go through. And it would be much more simple and straightforward if the defense team was able to meet with their client on a regular basis. Now it's monitored, now it's closely guarded, and access is much more difficult. So I believe that's why his defense attorneys fought so hard and offered everything under the sun in order to get him out, because it really impinges their ability to represent him to the best of their abilities.
Yeah, difficult to represent a client who is behind bars. So they have an uphill battle there. And of course, they are fighting an uphill battle in the court of public opinion because there has been nonstop discussion, an onslaught of publicity and conversation around the salacious allegations, as you mentioned, these freak offs, as they call them. We'll just use that term once. The parties that Diddy threw and all the celebrity he's known over the course of his career, and the prosecutors are saying this sort of commenced in 2009. So it's been a really long time. A lot of people are involved in this. How, John George, does a defense attorney litigate in the court of public opinion when, all your supposed friends are now really backing away, distancing themselves, and there is devastating video already against you and lawsuits upon lawsuits? What's the
Mhm.
challenge here? How do you tackle it?
I think that the defense attorney's best tact, and they've already alluded to this during their presentation of just whenever they've been on TV or briefly speaking about it, is the concept of consent. To what extent did consent play a role in the alleged victims and in this type of conduct that was going on? Sex trafficking, prostitution, basically coercing individuals under threat to have sex with people at parties, etc. To what extent was consent a key part of what happened in these individual instances? I believe the defense attorneys will focus on that. They've already come out, his team has already come out and said he's a flawed man. Mr. Combs is a flawed man that has made mistakes, but essentially he's not a criminal. So I think they're starting to color it in that they're going to say that he was a hip hop mogul that had tremendous success. That's been well known. It's been well documented over time. We have so many different celebrities that have pictures with Mr. Combs at his famous parties. He would host a white party where you'd have all the most famous celebrities in the world would be there. And these pictures are now flying all over the internet. Conspiracy theorists are trying to connect a million different dots of what's occurred or what's not occurred. I think that the defense team is tasked with a difficult public perception argument. However, they've already started laying out, here's how we're going to present Mr. Combs. You sort of already know who he is, but he's not a criminal. He didn't go above and beyond. These people that are claiming to be victims, they consented to what was happening and they were a part of it. I believe that's the tack that they're going to have to take in this case to be able to defeat some of the more difficult charges that Mr. Combs is facing. But there's obviously no doubt that from just a public perception, this is a difficult case to litigate not only in court, but in the court of public opinion.
Yeah, this follows the track of a lot of moguls who there were rumors, people whispered things, and but nobody was ever able to make anything stick. Or a lot of times people say that the prosecute people didn't care enough. Of course, Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein, R. Kelly, several of those who were many of those were tried already in the Southern District of New York, and now we have Diddy on trial. What do you think has been the arc of sort of the Me Too movement in terms of the public perception of what is a crime, what is a conspiracy of silence even, and whether prosecutors are more willing to dig through and find witnesses, get women to talk, and women are more willing to try to bring down some of these powerful people who have allegations against them of extreme criminal activity involving women, sex trafficking in this case, but yeah, sexual abuse.
I do think that one of the biggest legacies of the Me Too movement, and I think we've almost gotten to a post Me Too movement where we're just looking at the way prosecution are tackling these types of cases. But I think Harvey Weinstein really was the beginning of this. And I think that throughout our culture and throughout society, it was almost accepted and understood that these individuals with vast amounts of money, power, influence, control, they could change someone's career. They could change someone's life by giving them a certain opportunity. Mr. Combs could change someone's life by signing them to his label. He could make promises like that in return of potentially promises back to him. I think that society as a whole sort of accepted that that was just the name of the game. But as allegations have come out and as the individuals that you've gone through have been prosecuted and are now sitting behind bars for the conduct that was alleged by certain victims, it's becoming clear that this type of conduct, no matter if you are a regular person or whether you are a hip hop mogul or a top movie producer, that the law is going to be applied to you and that you're not going to be able to just wield power, influence, and money to take advantage of people in ways that are against their consent or to coerce them in ways that are against their consent. And I do think that the Department of Justice, from its outward policy perspective, takes this very seriously. And I know that through my own personal experience being an attorney litigating in this world, that the Department of Justice does like to bring a case against someone that's super famous to show the very point that I'm trying to make, which is no individual, regardless of power, influence, control, is going to be above the law. So I do think that the legacy of the Me Too movement is that it has exposed what I think a lot of people already believed was happening with powerful individuals, but now it's been put in the public spotlight. And I think the takeaway is these individuals will be held accountable if the allegations are supported by evidence.
Yeah, it does sound like they are certainly trying to make an example of Diddy with again denying the bail, the charges, the fact that he is actually of all the people we've been discussing, he is one of the not just highest profile, but well known, well regarded in some ways. But again, there were always questions that were surrounding him. But now we will see about the case against him and the prosecution proving their allegations. So it does show that, like you said, there is no impunity anymore, at least as the Southern District sees it. So we'll we'll see what happens next. I really appreciate you joining us again with your expertise, your prosecutorial perspective, defense perspective on this case and all the others. So we will continue following this, and I hope you will continue to join us, John George.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you.